This week's Torah portion is Vayetze, and he departed. And it refers, of course, to the departure, the rather rapid departure of Jacob from Beersheba to Haran. We're in Genesis chapter 28, verse 10. And this week's Torah portion follows the story of Jacob in the house of Laban, beginning when he first departs from Beersheba and ends just before his encounter with his brother Esau. And so when we meet Jacob in this week's portion, he's a lonely man. He's a young man who until this point has been really living with his parents, dependent upon the instructions of his mother. We have not seen him take any independent steps of his own. And indeed, when he first encounters Laban, we see him, even though he participated together with Rebekah in this trick, so to speak, of Esau, he doesn't seem to be a man truly capable of guile in any way. Laban manages to fool him, and fool him in a very serious way. He works for 7 years in order to marry Rachel, and at the end of the time, he has Leah. He's tricked, and when Laban comes to him, when Jacob complains, "Why did you give me Rachel?" Laban says, "Well, in our place, we always marry off the older before the younger." And Jacob is silent. He has no comeback. And he is forced then to work an additional 7 years, a total of 14 years, in order to have earned his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. And during this 14-year period, of course, he also has 11 children, and 11 sons and 1 daughter of 4 wives. Then we have the end of the portion where Jacob decides that it's time for him to leave, but first he would like to earn something so that he can go back home, having some property that he has, something to show for himself after these 14 years of working. And then begins a beginning of a negotiation where he speaks to Laban, and Laban says, "Well, tell me what salary you would like." Now, if you recall, when Jacob first speaks to Laban, when he first meets him, and Laban says to him, "Well, tell me what salary you want," and he says, "Well, I'd like to marry your daughter Rachel." That was the beginning of a tremendous fraud. This time, Jacob is wiser, and so when Laban says, "Sure, name your salary," Jacob decides he is not going to put himself in a position where Laban can trick him again. And therefore he comes up with this entire scheme where Laban is going to remove a good number of the flock, the ones that are speckled and spotted, and then Jacob, being left with the solid colors, he is then going to be able to keep any speckled or spotted sheep, goats, etc., that are born to these solid color ones, which is a highly unlikely arrangement, and yet God is on his side, God blesses him, etc. It is only at the end of this deal, when Jacob has already amassed quite a fortune in sheep and goats, that he recognizes the fact that Laban and Laban's family are not very happy with him. He suspects yet again that he will be tricked, and therefore he leaves in the dead of the night. And what I found very, very interesting is Jacob's speech. When Laban finally catches up to him, and he runs after Jacob and he finds him, he is very upset about 2 things, Laban. He's upset by the fact that he accuses Jacob of stealing his idols, and he accuses him, of course, of leaving in the dead of the night with his daughters and their children, etc. Now, Jacob does not know that Rachel has indeed stolen these idols, and therefore he is very angry that Laban would accuse him falsely of stealing something of which he knows nothing about. And in the course of his anger, he says, I think, he mentions in this speech, his discussion with Laban, he is extremely passionate, and I think at this point, for the first time, you get a true expression of what Jacob has been feeling and experiencing all these years in Laban's home. And we see that this is in chapter 31, and it begins in verse 31. And initially, of course, he says, just go take a look and see if you can find the idols. And of course, he's convinced that Laban won't find them, and indeed he doesn't. And at the point at which he comes back and he says, he can't find it. Verse 38, as follows. He says, this 20 years have I been with you. Your ewes and your she-goats have not lost their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. That which was torn I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. At my hands dost thou seek it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. He recounts how dedicated he has been. Going on to verse 41, I have now been 20 years in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you have changed my hire 10 times. And here we see something he had also mentioned a bit earlier to his daughters, that Laban throughout the 6-year period has consistently tried to trick him even out of this particular deal that they had made in good faith. And again, now we get to verse 42, which I think is the key. Unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the dread of Isaac had been with me, surely you had sent me away now empty. God has seen my misery and the labor of my hands, and reproved you yesternight. We now have a Jacob that has done everything he can to try to deal with this very dishonest Laban. When he first arrives in Laban's house and Laban tricks him out of his wife, he says nothing. He has no comeback. And we don't know anything about his faith at that point either. We assume he has very strong faith, but it is not mentioned. He is silent. Later on, when he enters into this arrangement with Laban, he doesn't want a salary arrangement because he has learned from his bad experiences, but he believes that by entering into some kind of very complicated arrangement, he will be able to outsmart Laban. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Well, it works in the end, but as he mentions to Rachel and Leah just before they're about to depart, and again here, Jacob at this point comes to a full understanding that without God's help, there is no way that he would have been able to outsmart Laban. There is no way he would have been able to survive in a very hostile world if it weren't for God. And I think this is a very, very important step and a very important situation that Jacob finds himself. And it is this recognition of the limitation. Yes, he really needed to try. He needed to be negotiating. But at the same time, he needs to understand that without God's help, none of this would have happened. It is this situation, this state of mind, that enables him to confront Esau, which we will read about in the next portion. Because in confronting Esau, he does a number of things. He prepares his camp. He divides them in such a way that if Esau will attack one, there'll be a separated camp and the others can flee. He prepares to go towards Esau and bring him gifts. He prepares all these very practical things so that he can deal with Esau and appease him or fight him as the case may be. But he also prepares himself with prayer. And I think it is this combination of negotiation, practical work, and relying on God's help that is the magic formula that enables Jacob to return to the land of Israel and indeed to be blessed. It would not have been enough for him if he had stayed with Laban and never tried to even amass any kind of cattle or sheep. He would have probably come back to the land of Canaan with absolutely nothing, which might have been all right. But at the end of the day, he was able to come back to the land of Canaan with material riches, but also with a very profound understanding that it was God helping him as he, in his own practical way, tried to outsmart Laban. It was that combination that really helped. And this is what we'll see Jacob through to the end of his days, to the end of the book of Genesis. Shabbat Shalom from Samaria.
Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat.